A very good morning from Startup Genome here in London. My name is Stephan. Very warm welcome to our Startup Genome Global Webinar Series, and actually the second iteration of our webinar series. Going forward over the next 60 minutes, we are going to take you through a number of sections. Let me start with a brief introduction as to the webinar series, put it into context. We want to give you an overview how Startup Genome tracks and globally benchmarks startup ecosystems. We'll have a look at the vast knowledge of network that we have built over the last up to 10 years with the global membership network. And then we want to hear from practitioners about the impact of what we are doing in tracking key ecosystem data. And I'm delighted to say today we are joined by the head of the Melbourne startup ecosystem, Dr. Kate Cornick, who will join us in about 25 minutes. And of course, an open Q&A, so most happy for any questions and a more open discussion to the end of this webinar. Let me put things a little bit into perspective. First of all, we hope with our new webinar series to provide practical advice, practical learning, practical insights for you as practitioners in your ecosystems in how to use our data, our tracking services, our branding service, and all the other activities you as members and potential new members of the Startup Genome Global Ecosystem Network can use in order to improve, to accelerate your own development. We obviously would love to hear your feedback as we go forward, so don't hesitate to shoot me and Adam here on the call an email anytime with ideas about topics, about things, how to improve our webinar series, etc. Always an open ear and most welcome. Previous topics, we've run the series once and many of you may have already participated. We had a look at our COVID-19 survey and response, which gave us key insights as to what happened during the early days and as the COVID-19 crisis progressed. We had a look at China. We could see as one of the first places in the world where COVID-19 hit our startup ecosystems. We could see the reaction of founders, the response of founders and their investors, and almost predict and advise other regions in the world as to what to expect and how best to use funding policy actually to secure, to save their startup ecosystems and enact the right policies going forward. Future topics, we want to be looking at how do you attract best talent, international resources, and position your ecosystem as a highly attractive place in the world for international talent and diverse talent to join you, your founders and your startups. That's going to happen over the next 10 days. And then many more to come. So stay updated on our webinar page, which you can see here on the slide, and links will be provided after our call. So please stay tuned. Okay, let's get right in. The startup ecosystem economy for us is when we value the value of startup ecosystems for us adds up to $2.8 trillion US. And that's, just to put it into perspective, on par with the GDP of a G7 economy. So that the value that has been created in the startup economy to this day, and irrespective of the impact that COVID may have had right now, it is an incredible story. That's for sure. Looking at the biggest companies being created over the last 10 years, at the moment, 5 of the top world's 10 of the top 10 companies in the world have been startups. Amazon, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, Tencent, you can see them in the ranking here. And we are not even counting Microsoft or Apple as we see them more as hardware companies, but put them in, you get 7 out of 10. Never in history has been such a concentration of top companies in one sector only. And you can see it here, automotive managed to produce 3 in their heyday, or semiconductors 2. So it is extraordinary, but what is also extraordinary is how startups have become the #1 engine of job creation. We are looking at Kaufman data here over the years since 2003, so through the first 2 crises of from 2000 till now. And have a look at the red line. These are our startups, and they are the only net producers of jobs, where traditional companies are destroying jobs as they progress in improving on their factor productivity and are shedding jobs on the way. So if you want to create not only jobs, but high quality jobs, well paid, interesting, attractive, the startup economy is the way to go. And that's why it is critically important, not only for founders in our ecosystems, but for politicians and for society overall. And I find personally these data absolutely striking. What's also striking, though, is the concentration that still remains when it comes to ecosystem value concentration. We value here, or we measure the impact of ecosystems simply by adding up exit values, and just see where San Francisco sits here on the graph, followed by New York, London, Beijing, Boston, Tel Aviv. And then when you look at the blue dots here, or the blue line, these are the next 100 cities in the world. And just see how small their participation still is. Things are improving. Our global startup ecosystem report, GSER 2020, shows the very positive development as we spread the ideas of startup community development, ecosystem development around the world. And there are lots of cities coming through. But again, the concentration still remains. Our mission at Genome from the beginning to this very day is to break this concentration by building a network in which we learn from each other. We use great policies, great activities, great initiatives in order to participate more actively in the value creation and job creation of the startup ecosystems. Yeah, the success of your startup should not depend on where you sit in the world. Is it a London, New York, Singapore, or is it a Lagos, a Taipei, or Nur Sultan? That should not matter in the end. In the ideal world, gender, ethnicity, or social background, it should not matter. We aim to spread the genome of startup ecosystems, what makes them work everywhere. Externally, what can you see from us? What will you be most familiar with? Certainly the GSER. We are proud to say we've just launched it about 2 weeks ago at the TNW and Financial Times conference. A global report that seeks to put all the ecosystems we measure around the world on every continent into perspective. We use about 40 of the 100 metrics we have available in our little armory. And we use ecosystem ranking and produce an index that puts ecosystems into different perspectives, a global ranking, a regional ranking. But interestingly, also we are going into subsectors in order to discover where's the most interesting place to do healthcare, life sciences, mobility, fintech, you name it, because these specializations sometimes show really different and relevant trends that we want to surface and make available. Behind the scenes, we do quite a lot more than the GSER. Ecosystem 360 Monitor, the topic of our webinar today, core topic, but also an in-depth assessment and global benchmarks for your ecosystem, provide you with the data, the metrics, but also the global benchmarks amongst relevant peers, not always comparing to Silicon Valley, but amongst relevant peers in order to really determine, are these policies, these initiatives that you are enacting, are they working? Or should they be improved? Should they be possibly even stopped as if they don't show the results that we would be expecting and that we would be expecting by comparing with relevant peers in the world? Putting priorities to ecosystem gaps, hugely important for us. We are always very conscious about everybody is motivated and wants to do a lot right from the start of ecosystem development. We are a little bit more cautious based on what we've seen over the last 5-6 years since we started this activity. We're saying, well, there are activities that are right for a certain ecosystem life cycle phase. Have a plan for the next 12 months, do the things immediately that should be done, but also have a considerate approach to a midterm development strategy and a long-term perspective. So something from 2 to 3 to 4 years, and then 5+ years, and really line up these initiatives, policies, etc., as they are fit in a certain point of time. Developing strategies and action plans, we call it roadmap. That's typically another piece of advice that we are most happy to provide. And then last but not least, it's always the question, there's a strategy, there's a roadmap, how do I implement, where do I find the best experts in the world, from funding policy to talent, to setting up an accelerator. And again, please let us know if you're considering any of these activities, and we'd be happy to make the connection to the global experts that we've managed to identify over the years. That's a little bit of us. Back to our 360 ecosystem monitor. What we found when we looked at this topic is certainly that most of our economic development metrics and strategies, obviously, that follow metrics, or the other way around, if you will, are stuck in an industrial era. They have been conceived in order to measure traditional corporate activity, traditional SME, small, medium enterprise activity. But the world, as I explained in the beginning, has certainly moved on. And with our new data science, we try to provide the metrics and the assessments that help you navigate the transition to an innovation, to a digital economy, to a startup, economy. So to provide the additional metrics, not abolishing the old ones, but providing an additional set of metrics that really allows you as leaders in ecosystems, you as politicians thinking about good policy, you as participants in the ecosystems to measure the right things and have the right gauge on what is happening. Ecosystem 360 Monitor, our newest product here, our most regular tracking product. That's the one I want to give you a little bit more insight right now. We call it the numbers you need to monitor and to compare, to peer benchmark your startup ecosystem on a very regular basis. So different to GSER 2020, 2019, an annual publication of ours. What we are doing now here is providing our member network with monthly, quarterly, half-yearly assessments as they see fit. So very quick, very fast KPIs that are available. 4 buckets constitute the 360 monitor, and I want to show you just a very few samples, but the buckets are performance overall, ecosystem performance, what's the value, funding policy, to have a gauge on funding policies and their effects, talent as a critical input, and obviously how well the fabric of community locally, but also internationally is working. How connected are founders in your community? How sound and healthy is the community? These are the 4 major buckets, and let's just go into a few examples to illustrate what we are talking about here theoretically. Performance constitutes ecosystem value, and we use exits overall, all the exits we can measure, larger exits in particular, 50 million in valuation and plus, and non-tech exits, and break them down into their different constituting components. That for us allows to create a measure of ecosystem value. And if you go back in my presentation in the beginning, where I showed San Francisco, New York, London, and the vast concentration, these slides are exactly produced by using ecosystem value. For you, relevant if you report back to a government, to say that's the economic, that's our gauge for economic contribution. It's the top line value to create interest and to track really what is happening in terms of value creation for the overall economy. That's performance. Put it into perspective, into long timelines. We are smoothing the data, monthly exit data that we see that often have very high peaks and fluctuation by using 3 and 6 months moving annual totals in order to show longer term trends. And what you see here is March 19 to May 2020 across a number of interesting ecosystems. No doubt we can see the impact here, March, April, May, when it comes to current crisis impacting our ecosystems. But again, that's typically the view you would have, and peer comparison already shown here. Compare yourself against a Helsinki, a Stockholm, a Singapore, etc. Hundreds more available on the database to do that. Why is the measure so important? Why are exits so important? Because we believe that large exits, 50, 100 million plus, are not only economic value creators in their own right, they also, and quite possibly more importantly, are lighthouses of success. They attract other potential founders, students, whoever is considering a career in entrepreneurship to follow, because they don't demonstrate the success. People can see it and they start to follow, community gets activated and follows. So that's highly impressive. Exits are certainly an important measure in the ecosystems. Who sport most of those are much more in the spotlight and much more attractive for talent on a global basis. Funding, these were just a few examples. Funding, let's go through a little bit here. First of all, we have a look at overall funding that's available to the ecosystem as the fuel that allows our founders and startups really to grow. Early stage funding, and we really break it down into the different sizes and funding deals. And late stage funding, as many of our ecosystems who've started early and have developed quite well are now not only looking at the startup environment, but particularly the scale-up environment that is so important for larger job creation and larger economic effects, much more important actually than young startups when you see it from an overall economic contribution perspective. So late stage funding, Series B plus deals are our gauge here, and we measure them accordingly. We also have a look at investor activity. How active are your national, your local investors, but also international investors in your ecosystem, as another gauge that allows us to predict a little bit more how many deals are there to come and how healthy is the investor landscape in your ecosystem. Last but not least, different price points, cost of labor, play a huge role when we talk about financial runway. So funding is one side, but cost is obviously the other. And we seek to calculate the runway that our founders have. Runway as a measure with the money I got as investment, and the labor cost for highly talented engineers and growth talent. How far can I get? 3 months, 6 months, 9 months? How is my funding? And do I get the time as a startup to really develop a competitive product that's globally competitive? Do I have enough money to do that? Do I have enough financial runway? So that's the runway metric here, hugely important, particularly in peer comparison. So we always try to juxtapose funding on the one side, but also the cost that a business is looking at in the particular location it operates in. Changes in funding types over the years. So here you would typically see the trends towards more scaling. And I have to apologize, we got a little presentation problem here. Just give me 1 sec, please. Yes, this slide has just changed. Apologies, we are back. So different funding types in ecosystems. Look at seed, Series A, Series B, Series C, and you should see as you move from startup to a larger scaling segment, obviously the increase of later stage funding deals from Series A plus, B, C, and so forth. Another example of how to use these metrics. Growth and funding deals here again shown as very long timelines in order to demonstrate what is happening on a more strategic perspective. And again, the notion of peer comparison over the years to really compare how are you doing in comparison to ecosystems that you consider as your peers and that are in your life cycle, ecosystem life cycle phase. So carefully selected. Funding runway, I was speaking at length about the importance of juxtaposing cost and funding. And that's what we can see here in this slide, just demonstrated. That's the funding runway for our startups. And investor activity, again, shown across a number of sample ecosystems, just to illustrate what it is. Talent, the next important bucket, and to give you also a little bit of a view of the metrics. Access to talent, first of all. So the number of software developers and the number of experienced growth talent in your ecosystem. Secondly, the quality. So the one is the number, the quantity, now the quality. How many of those are top talent when it comes to engineering, but also when it comes to software development. Thirdly, the cost, spoke about that, juxtaposing funding and cost. And increasingly important, the rate of layoffs and the average experience at layoffs. So this tells us a lot about how much talent is available in the market for new companies to be formed and to quickly hire and get to that talent that's critically important. Obviously, in our COVID-19 analysis, we also saw the detrimental effect of funding drying up and layoffs happening very quickly, and have advised many governments in order to preserve the structures of startups by providing additional funding, so to keep layoff numbers at least for a certain period of time under control. But these are the typical data you would be looking at. Access to local developers, again shown here in a peer comparison. Just have a look at Tel Aviv. Fantastically successful ecosystem, but when it comes to access to talent, Tel Aviv is majorly challenged. Its own success provides the challenges to the environment. That's obviously not a secret. Immigration constraints in Israel exacerbate the situation quite a bit. So Tel Aviv, fantastic ecosystem, but if you are on the hunt for talent, you are challenged. You will be paying obviously a much higher price. You can see it here in comparison. What's the situation in other peer ecosystems? Here we try to put it into perspective to top quality. So these are the top GitHub developers that we can track. And again, if I'm in Tel Aviv founding a company, I'm obviously challenged much more than if I would be in Vancouver or in Singapore, where we have access to a much larger number of top technical talent per startup. Salaries, again, to put it into perspective and to have a gauge on the cost development in an ecosystem. As ecosystems heat up, Silicon Valley, New York, London are classical examples of that. Costs tend to go through the roof as the market becomes more competitive, and it's particularly the market for talent. Tracking that over time will give you a healthy gauge on how price levels for top talent are developing, and where you need to possibly enact policy in order to create more talent or attract talent from abroad in order to mitigate wage trends, labor cost trends. Community, last one I want to touch upon. We want to track, and we do that since many years, the connectedness of communities. How healthy are communities? How willing are people to help each other? And we do that in the 360 product simply by using events activity, meetup data, etc., in order to see how many events are there. So what's the possibility to coalesce around a certain topic, be it in blockchain, be it around growth hacking, be it around funding, or just be it about a social event. So are there the platforms for people to meet, and how are their numbers growing? Because this gives us a gauge, a very practical gauge on what's happening in community. We're also looking at cancellation of events to see, are there any trends particularly relevant right now? When you look at data, no surprises here. Community engagement is less, at least physically, in March, April. There's no surprise. That's what we can see in the data all across the ecosystems. Yeah, so that's pretty much the 4 buckets explained with a number of examples. What's different about Startup Genome's 360 monitor compared to the many other indices and tracking data you may see? First of all, a very sound basis for our data. We use Crunchbase, PitchBook, and Dealroom, who are our strategic partners. And we also augment these data with social signals and web scale data that we scrap from the internet and from different sources there. GitHub, I mentioned, and you've seen the examples. I mentioned it here, and you've seen the examples on many slides. Meetup.com, parachute list, so the people who are leaving and layoff data are coming right from there. And obviously salary data from a number of vendors such as Glassdoor, Salary.com, and PayScale. And what is quite special is the data science behind it. We are not relying upon one of those sources only, but we constantly triangulate the different sources and use data science in order to get to the most realistic scenario and the most high quality scenario here in our metrics. So that's certainly something that's quite unique in order to use a vast array of data sources in order to provide a much more holistic picture as you would get it when you operate with one of these sources only. So metrics that matter. Based on a decade of experience, we've been doing exactly this, providing metrics, analyzing metrics, and distilling strategy out of them for more than a decade now, speaking in 2020. Comprehensive databases, standardized, cleaned, aggregated, triangulated. We are confident that our data are the best approximation of what's happening in the real world that is available on a global scale. Timely, with 360, we are moving into monthly, quarterly, or annually data provision as you see fit. Monthly, incredibly fast tracking. So if you're enacting policy, if you are enacting certain initiatives, here is for the first time a measurement instrument that's quick enough to pick up trends very early on and provide constant monitoring that can be added to national statistics or ecosystem monitoring products, packages, really to give real-time feedback. Globally benchmarkable. So that's unique. You can really select your peers as you see fit and compare yourself against those startup ecosystems that are most relevant to your own environment. So don't always use the comparison to Silicon Valley, but more the ones that are much more close to your own environment in terms of size and characteristics. And that's absolutely possible with Ecosystem 360. List at the metrics, don't let me read them out here, but have a look after our call. This is the constituent metrics of the 360 monitor product, and it is very, very comprehensive as already demonstrated. I've been talking quite a bit about peer benchmarking. Peer benchmarking obviously comes from a network, and what you see here is the Startup Genome network, how it is developed in May, June 2020, a vast coverage of the world. If you look at the green dots, these are our newest members. We are really expanding our network. We've been very successful in doing so over the last few years, covering nearly every continent. And important to mention, for Ecosystem 360, we go beyond our network. We also use the data sources that are previously showed for about 360 cities around the world. So what you may not yet see here so strongly is Latin America as an example. using the databases we've shown, the secondary data that we triangulate so well. They allow us to also look into Latin America, into Africa, and other parts of the world that are not shown on our member network here. So this is the close-knit startup genome members network. The data beyond it is 360 plus cities that you can look at and peer benchmark with, which is certainly unique. Why is all of that so important? We believe that metrics is one thing. Learning from global experts, peers, is equally or more important. And what is particularly important is not learn only from successes. Everybody is successful and happy to boast about it and demonstrate their successes. What the learning typically is better when you look at policy failures. Yeah, what didn't go well? Failures, obviously, we are all not proud of our shortcomings, are better shared behind closed doors, and closed doors here is the member network of Startup Genome, where also these failures and things that didn't work as well in terms of policy are being openly discussed and advice is being given. So in order to prevent for others to make the same mistakes and really get on this learning curve and tap this global fabric of ecosystem development knowledge. I've been talking for quite a while now, and I'm delighted to have Dr. Kate Cornick with us today, the CEO of LaunchVic, who has been a member of the Startup Genome Network for many years, a very sound, sometimes also very critical advisor who has really helped us to up our game. And Kate, I would love to get you to our webinar here, just to give us a brief feeling of how do you use the data? How do you use the metrics? How do you use what you get from the network in order to accelerate what you are doing in Melbourne? Yeah, we seem to have to wait for about 1 or 2 minutes until we get Kate dialed in. So apologies. At the stage 2 minutes, that's the studio telling me Kate will be with us. So let me make a few more remarks. If you got any questions, discussions, we will do that after Kate has joined us. But also after the webinar, please don't hesitate to contact either myself, based here in London for the European and Asian time zone, and our Chief Innovation Officer based in San Francisco, Arnovio Morelix. Again, happy to engage in the discussion, happy to learn also from your input as we constantly strive to improve our metrics and our products going forward. And obviously on the call today is Adam. Contact details also provided in the slide deck, who would be happy to follow up in any questions that you may see fit. Hello, Kate. A very good evening to Melbourne. You're from London. Hello. So glad to have you with you. And Kate, yeah, the floor really is you. We've been working together for many years. I said it on the webinar already. You've been somebody who's been using the Startup Genome metrics, but you've also been a candid, a critical voice sometimes, have helped us improve what we are doing, a very vocal voice in the global network, the members network. So we are so happy and delighted to have you here, and we would really love to just hear from you. If you could share a little bit, how do you use the data? How do you use the metrics? What do you practically, what I've been presenting here when you sit in Melbourne and in your vibrant and very successful ecosystem? We've been speaking about that 2 weeks ago. Impressive story. So we'd really love to hear from you for a little while. Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me here, and hello to everybody on the call. So we've been using Startup Genome's data since LaunchVic, which is the state government startup agency, was brought into inception just under 4 years ago. And I think, you know, we can't understate the importance of Startup Genome's data in helping us grow as an ecosystem. I think when you're starting out, it's really easy to sort of focus locally, but ultimately startup ecosystems and startups themselves are a global game. And what matters is how you're comparing and how you're learning against what's happening around the rest of the world. And so I think the startup genome data has been unbelievably helpful in helping us formulate our approach. And, you know, we're very proud of what we achieved. Our ecosystem's doubled in size since year on year, since 2018. We're now a challenger ecosystem. I think a few years ago, we weren't really that, you know, high up in any of the ecosystem rankings. So I think there's a lot that we've taken from the data that's helped us implement opportunities to grow. And I think there are 2 points that I could really pick out. About 2 years ago, one of the areas that we thought we were doing quite well on was local connectedness. And JF was on the call and had to break the news to me, despite the work that we'd done. We actually weren't doing very well on local connectedness. There was a lot of activity, but it wasn't activity that was resulting in outcomes. And it was a result of us hearing that. We started to run events and really hammered home the fact that we had all these people in a room, and being in a room is not just about coming to listen to a startup speaker speak and then leave. You want to engage, you want to find out what people do, seek potential investors, seek potential customers, and really encourage that activity. So it's been a real mantra of ours to encourage that local connectedness. And in this year's results, we're actually doing, I think, better than average, which is really great. So that's one example of where, you know, data from Startup Genome helped us. And actually, it was very low cost. It wasn't a program we had to put in place. We were already running a huge number of events. It was just about reminding people about the importance of local connectedness. And it's not just about showing up to an event. You actually need to connect. And us just reiterating that message has made a difference. Another example is our finance data. And it's fair to say that while Melbourne is doing really well in a lot of areas, one of the areas that we had a gut feel we weren't doing particularly well was the investor landscape. We don't have a large number of VCs. We only had 2 active angel groups. And through the data that we've got from Startup Genome, we've been able to benchmark ourselves against the rest of the world and take that data to government and say, look, we really are underperforming and our sector is very important. There's lots of things we can do and create jobs, and particularly in this environment post-COVID. But, you know, at the end of the day, what matters is us being able to present data that's going to help influence government to make funding decisions to us, which we then make funding decisions into this community, as well as policy changes. So again, Startup Genome's data has been incredibly useful in helping us formulate that approach and designing the programs that we put in place.
Kate, thanks so much for the quick overview. Delighted to hear how the data have helped you turn around an event strategy, a community strategy. And the one element I find is particularly interesting, you mentioned it is not a lot of money. Sometimes, not only sometimes, as an analyst, I see a lot of policy, a lot of activity, a lot of resource investment that sometimes is not well calibrated. So people put a lot of resource, a lot of effort, a lot of sweat, and a lot of taxpayers' money ultimately into a number of initiatives that are not perfectly calibrated. And just by doing some tweaks, and you mentioned what you did in your event strategy, you get very different outcomes. So a small data point, a small sets of data points that allows to correct for a multi-year strategy and repurpose taxpayers' money ultimately, and with all our efforts. That's incredibly great to hear. Yeah. Just out of curiosity, how many times do you use the data? Is this something where you would say, I need these metrics every 3 months, I need them every 6 months?
Yeah.
Are there politicians maybe picking up on it in their regular briefing meetings where you have to provide a number of data points?
Yeah, we would actively use the data at least every 6 months when we have to report to government. We also use it in our budget bids that we prepare to government to ask for funding. But more importantly, we use it all the time in reporting to the sector, because it's not just about as an agency responsible for growing the startup ecosystem. Yes, a big part of our job is about getting government to support us and understanding the importance of the startup sector. And there's a whole raft of information, not only the data that we get from Startup Genome, but more broadly the narrative that Startup Genome provides through their reports that provide really useful proof points. And so a big part of my job is talking to government and convincing them that this sector is a sector that's worth investing in. And that at times can be challenging when you're competing with other sectors. But the other thing is we need to be talking to the ecosystem. And, you know, I'm out and about giving talks all the time, and I'll rarely go a talk where I don't mention the ecosystem valuation or the number of startups or something along those lines, so that we, you know, are talking to the community about raising optimism, encouraging more people to start startups, helping startups connect with investors, helping startups understand some of the challenges in the ecosystem and what they can do to help address that, or indeed talking to investors about the fact that we do need to really radically improve our investor landscape if we're going to be globally competitive as an ecosystem. So we use the data formally at least every 6 months, but informally we would use it weekly.
That's impressive. Thank you so much, Kate, for letting us know here. Yeah, I think that's really a great deep dive. Maybe just out of interest, we've been doing quite some work around COVID. You've been using the data. You had the discussions in the members network as well. Again, using these fast track data in order to almost anticipate what's coming. We had a look at China. We tried to extrapolate a little bit what might we be expecting in North America and Europe. And how far was that helpful for your most recent work?
Yeah, it's incredibly useful, and probably more than, you know, we look at it probably very differently from the data on Melbourne and the deep dive ecosystem monitor that we get on Melbourne, which is really about how can we improve the ecosystem. I think the data around COVID has been really important about how do we improve the narrative about why supporting this sector is more important than ever. So the underlying data on Melbourne still is there. I mean, the reality is, as I've mentioned, that our investor landscape is not as strong as other ecosystems that we compare ourselves to through the global data. That problem existed pre-COVID, and then we see data around declines in venture capital, particularly at Series A and seed, that have brought forward, and that helps us bolster our narrative. And we're having obviously a lot of discussions with government around support for the sector, and we have made a number of interventions. We've activated quite a lot of private sector capital through various initiatives over the last few months, but we continue to work with government on initiatives that will help improve the investor landscape. And that global perspective is often really, really important when you're talking to government, because you know, coming along and saying we want more money for Melbourne's ecosystem is one thing, but if we can come along and say we want more money for Melbourne's ecosystem because we believe that we're on a trajectory to get into the top 30 ecosystems, which will really encourage Melbourne to be seen as one of the leading global hubs around the world. It keeps our competitiveness high. And by the way, if we don't invest, we started off with a credit crunch problem, and you know, this is exacerbated by COVID, evidenced by this data from Startup Genome. You know, we can have that dialogue with government and help convince them that we are the sector to invest in. So it's both the hard data that allows us to compare ourselves. And I think one of the things I'd say on the comparison is, I think it's quite easy for governments to sort of focus, particularly a country like Australia, which is federated. So we have states, we have a number of cities. I know people would be aware of Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and Adelaide. And there can sometimes be quite a nationalistic approach of how do we compare to Sydney or how do we compare to Brisbane? And from our perspective, you know, that interstate rivalry is, you know, it's healthy in a way, because whatever another ecosystem does locally to rise the tide, it puts the competitive pressure back on us to do more. But I'm less worried about how we compare in Australia, because we are also Team Australia. And what I'm more interested in is how do we compare to other regions that are attracting capital and attracting talent. So for us, you know, what's happening in New Zealand, what's happening in Singapore, what's happening in Korea, in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia is really, really important for our region, because we want to be attracting the best talent and the best capital. And we want to be positioning Melbourne as a city that is globally competitive, not nationally competitive. And that is where Startup Genome's data is invaluable, because what we can do in a national level in Australia as a state authority is quite limited. We can compare ourselves on a national level through a variety of different mechanisms that are available, but it's very hard to get that global competitiveness and benchmarking. And it's not to say that we're trying to go head to head with those cities and states, but we certainly want to have an understanding of where they sit and where their strengths are, and how we can build a narrative that is going to create Melbourne as a competitive place, which goes to making sure that we are creating a pipeline of talent and a pipeline of investment, both homegrown locally as well as attracting interstate and internationally.
Kate, thanks so much. And I completely agree. I've had many discussions with government leaders in many parts of the world. And the moment you kind of reject the conversation from this is gut feeling, this is experience, to something that's objective data, it's peer comparison. You believe you've been doing well, and yes, you did. But you're by no means at the level where we would expect you to be. That's a very compelling discussion, which all of a sudden opens a very different level of discussion, a different level of accessing public funding, budgeting. I find it particularly powerful, and always use the data-based approach in order to have a more objectified discussion, so to speak.
Yeah,
and take away the anecdotal evidence and replace it a little bit with that's more objectivity.
I was going to pick up on that, because I think, at the end of the day, politicians and government leaders and corporate leaders who are not familiar with the startup ecosystem, many of them have been on trade missions, whether it's to Silicon Valley, to Boston, to London, to Israel, to Singapore. They've seen global startup ecosystems. And I think it's very easy for them to walk away with an anecdotal kind of, we could be the next Silicon Valley. And actually, having the data that supports an evidence base to say, well, Israel and Singapore are great ecosystems. Their government started investing in 1995, and it started paying off about 20 years later. And that's when the returns really started to kick in. Is really, really important, because you can also set the narrative about what government's expecting. Because otherwise, I think certainly my experience is that there can be a propensity to say, well, this startup ecosystem is really cool, just make it happen. It will happen overnight. And it's not going to happen overnight. And the best ecosystems in the world have had long-standing, including Silicon Valley, long-standing government support to get them started. And once they're sustainable, as Silicon Valley is, then government can take a back seat. But to begin with, it is many, many years of support that has to happen. And I think that's, again, a narrative that particularly government can get hoodwinked by this sort of Hollywoodization of the Facebook movie and other things, that all this stuff just happens overnight. You click your fingers and you invest a little bit of money, and suddenly you're going to be the central hub of startups. And being able to present the evidence to say, well, if we do want to repeat what happened in Israel, we're going to have to invest a lot of money over a lot of time, do a lot of initiatives, and draw on our strengths and draw on our talent, and draw on our investor community and our high net worth community to make it happen. And so you can set out the roadmap of where you want to go. And so, as an agency, you can then have reasonable objectives to achieve. It's not about make Melbourne Silicon Valley in a click of a fingers. It's about turn Melbourne into a globally competitive tech startup hub that's competing on a national stage, that's going to contribute to local jobs, contribute to a prosperous economy. But this is going to take 10 years plus to get there.
Kate, I just wanted to ask you, how long do you foresee this development? I think you gave us the answers at minimum a decade, and based in London, this story is possibly quite the same. 2009-10 was really the kickoff, and look where we are today. Certainly coming from a good perspective, or good basis, but the development has been incredibly fast. I'm also glad, thank you for mentioning the word roadmap, because we like to use data and the concept of what we call an ecosystem lifecycle model. That really brings to bear the different situations where a startup ecosystem may be in its developments, like a living being. You're a child, you're growing up. You need different nurturing, different measures, as opposed to somebody who is a teenager, to stay with the analogy, or somebody who's really a grown up and needs very different treatment, very different learning experiences, and so forth. That's exactly what we try to do with lifecycle modeling and devising these roadmaps, using data to see where on the roadmap should you be, and what should really be the action that particularly policymakers should take on a short-term basis, a mid-term basis. I mentioned these timeframes, and on a longer-term basis, 5 years plus, even a 10-year scenario. Where do you really want to be, and what's the comparison, the peer comparison? What's realistic? What's ambitious? But also what's realistic to achieve? Because sometimes you meet a city mayor who believes the city will be on the map of the top 20, 30 ecosystems in no time. The reality is very different. proud to say one of our clients, our members, I should say, Seoul has just made it into the top 20. And that's an incredible story. But it also has been backed up by many years of development that the mayor and the municipality already have put behind it, similar to the tremendous story of Melbourne.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And it is going to take time.
Kate, thanks so much for joining us. I always love to hear really the perspective from a practitioner, from a network member. And as having said, you've always helped us with very practical, very candid advice, and sometimes also critical advice, which we love, so we can make it even better.
Well, it goes both ways.
Yes, indeed. We are allowed to be critical as well. That's
yeah,
great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and on that note, I'd love to open up the discussion again, Kate. Thanks very much for spending time with us in your well-deserved evening. On that note, I would like to open it up a little bit to questions from the audience to see what's on your mind when we talk about Data 360 Monitor, the X-ray vision of your ecosystem. So please chip in. Trying to see. Whilst we wait, Kate, for the questions coming through, again, coming to the usage, the frequency of data. You mentioned before, it is in your own practical work almost a weekly tool gauge that you use. Have you seen any interest from, say, national statistical offices? I made the point before, we are, from a national statistics perspective, a government perspective, many metrics are still stuck in the industrial era, the corporations, traditional SMEs. Do you see any shift, even in these maybe a little bit slower reacting national statistical offices, etc., using different metrics to really gauge this important part of the economy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yes, there is interest, but I also think it's almost like moving the Titanic, because you I'm hoping you can still hear me. I apologize.
Kate, you broke up for the last 30 seconds.
I apologize. So hopefully I'm back now. We've had a bit of an outage here today. We're having new broadband installed, which is never a good day when we're giving some talks. But what I was going to say is that, yes, there are, the national statistics. It's like moving the Titanic. They collect data, but they're not necessarily set up to collect the data at the speed that we collect data. So, for example, I've had a discussion with our National Bureau around a unicorn that was founded in 2015. It's one of the fastest growing unicorns in Australia. And probably the world, founded by 4 people in 2015, and by last year, mid-2019, they had reached $1 billion valuation. The company is called Airwallex. Now, there's only been one data collection through the national census between 2015 and now, and the company probably would have recorded around 10 employees at that time. Yet it's a company that's gone on to employ well over 500 people and have a valuation of $100 billion. So there's a real time lag, but I think it's also about how do you convince the powers that be that you want this to become the norm, rather than just, oh, well, that's one anomaly that we didn't capture. And so the reality is these I think the national bureaus of statistics do need support in understanding what startups are, and that then goes into a discussion which is very active in Australia about what the definition of a startup is. Is a startup a high growth disruptive company, which is what we consider very much aligned with Startup Genome, or is a small business a startup as well? And so there's a lot of debate going on, and certainly in Australia around this, which then feeds back to what sort of data do you want to capture? Because if you're saying all new businesses are startups, you capture a very different data set. And from our perspective in Victoria, we take a very increasingly refined view about startups, very closely aligned to Startup Genome. And if we're not capturing the right data, we can't actually measure the system. And you want to measure the system so you can put in place the right policy changes. So, you know, we certainly draw on Startup Genome data. We do also draw on national data, but we certainly rely on Startup Genome data more than we rely on national data, because you know, the reality is we get a better data set that's more timely and more in tune with our sector.
As a network, as a community, it's been my passion, Kate, to bang the drum for revisiting how we nationally measure our economic performance. Because to your point, otherwise we might just come to the wrong results or very outdated results. If I may, there are really interesting additional questions coming through. So one, when you think about LaunchVic, did you focus first of all on specific industries, or more broader? Are you more tech agnostic? And if so, if you have a certain sector focus, did the data, did the metrics help you make these decisions at some point?
Yeah, so yes, we sort of do. We're generalist in where we support, but we do know that in Melbourne, 1 in 5 startups are in, broadly speaking, the health industry, whether that's deep technologies like biotech through to, you know, medical apps that help people get fit. That health is a very strong area of ours, but it's an area that we you know, do need to delve into a little bit more in the Startup Genome data, because the strengths that we have are not being reflected in the data. So that then poses a really interesting question for us about what is going on there, that you know, we know we've got a lot of startups in that sector, but we're not having the success in that sector compared to our, you know, cities that we would consider global peers. And an example around that is our research. You know, we are we've got a precinct called Parkville, it's just north of Melbourne, and it's one of the top research hubs for biotech in the world. It's very research orientated. We're not very good at commercializing. And so Startup Genome is obviously approaching from a commercial perspective and measuring companies. So I think what we're seeing in Startup Genome's data is not necessarily helping us set the sector, because we already know where the sector strengths are. We've got this amazing precinct, which is you know, one of the world's best cancer research centers, infectious disease, and also brain science. So 3 things that this is in top 3 in the world in terms of research. So why is it the data isn't helping us set that sector, because we already know that. But what the data is helping us do to go, well, something's fundamentally wrong, because on one metric around research, we really are world class. And yet in Startup Genomes, we're really underperforming. So some of the things we know we're not producing commercializing research as well, but we also know that we have got a quantity of startups in the healthcare sector. So why is it that those startups, that 1 in 5 startups are in health, why are we not seeing massive amounts of Series A and Series B health tech startups come through? And so is that then taking us back to look at our investor weaknesses? And we know the funding cycles for med techs and biotechs are longer. So when we've already got a funding problem, is it that we just are not got enough qualified investors and qualified capital to understand that investment cycle and take that risk? That's one thing that we're looking at. Another thing is, you know, the skills base. Is it that we haven't got enough people that can work at these companies and grow them here? And so it's not so much helping us choose the sector, but it's helping us validate which sector we're choosing and why are we not being as good as we think we should be in that particular area.
And Kate, thanks for pointing it out. Many a place over the world where you see tremendous R&D capability, academic capability, then you always wonder, why is there not an industry? Why this is not leading to commercial activity? Why are there not more startups picking up this opportunity? And you mentioned it in our buckets, as we call them: funding, talent, but also community. How's the link between R&D, between academia, between university labs into the economy, and to have the ability to measure that. So that's great to hear, and the way you use it in Melbourne. We've seen it in so many places where R&D is outstanding and really should be activated, but in the end it feeds an engine of patents, of publications and citations, very academic, as opposed to creating the positive economic impacts. Another question, if I may, is in terms of benchmarking. I think the question goes to me from the public, first of all, from the audience. Which cities can we choose in order to benchmark ourselves? So my advice would be use cities that are in a similar life cycle phase, or in a life cycle phase that's just above you. So in our model, we got 4 different phases. compare yourself with somebody who is really on par, it's the same life cycle phase, but also always have a look to the next one. So activation would be the starting point for us for very nascent young ecosystems. Globalization, you start building a scaling segment is the second one. Always have a look at these slightly more ambitious ones as you form strategies that have 2, 3, 5-year time horizons would be my advice here. And in terms of the availability through Genome's 360 monitor, today you can choose almost amongst 360 cities around the world to work through these buckets, value creation, these 4 buckets of ecosystem value, talent, funding, and health of community. But Kate, you might have some ideas. So which ones are the ones you are looking at in Melbourne? You already mentioned it. It's not about a national competition with Sydney and others, but you're looking much broader, and maybe you're looking from a sectorial perspective as well.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I concur with your views around, you know, looking at the cities that are just a little bit further ahead with you. Mm-hmm. We also bring an overlay of, you know, we've built a good dialogue with our government about benchmarking, and I think JF a couple of years ago sat down with me and walked me through a benchmarking comparison and gave us some cities that we should compare to. And I think that included Vancouver or Toronto, Barcelona, as well as Singapore and you know, Sydney, very obviously, because they're on our doorstep. And so we took that advice. And I think from a government agency point of view, I think it's important that we've just continued benchmarking against those cities, because all of them are ahead of us. Some of them have accelerated quite a lot, and some of them have sort of probably slowed down a little bit. But I think there's something very important about being consistent about the way you compare, so that you're not changing the goalposts year on year and you're having the same discussion with government. So we haven't changed the cities that we compare to, because we think that we can just, if we keep benchmarking against the same cities, we can say our target is to get to this size, and we can show that we're moving along that progress. So I totally agree about choosing cities that are a little bit further ahead, but I also think there's something about a continuity in who you're benchmarking against.
Yeah, definitely so. And I'm glad you mentioned it. You worked with our founder, JF Gauthier, on identifying the right ones. So again, for the participants today, we are most happy to provide a little bit of advice, because ecosystems, by means of their character, the sectorial focus or the life cycle stage, they may require very different benchmarks, and the right selection really sets the tone for, as Kate just put it, for the next few years, because you don't want to move the comparison every 5 minutes and come to different conclusions. Yeah, we are almost out of time. Kate, thank you again so much for giving us this great overview. All the best to Melbourne. Stay safe.
Thank you.
And we hope to see you on the Members Network very quickly and very, very soon again. So a big thank you to Australia. And
pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
So to conclude, as a key takeaway, most of our economic development metrics and the strategies that ultimately are being used or being formed on these metrics, from our perspective, when we look at national governments and municipalities, are really still stuck. And I think Kate made the point with the National Statistics Office, stuck to a degree in a different era, where we were looking at corporates, where we were looking at traditional SMEs, but we've dramatically moved on as we democratize access to the startup communities and ecosystems. So for you, understand where you are, enable your ecosystem to capture a larger, hopefully a much larger share of the global startup economy, and this incredibly wealth creation that we've demonstrated is what we want to do, where we want to support you, use the metrics, evaluate the metrics that we've been discussing today. With Ecosystem 360, we believe we got a very fast and very condensed capability to track, to inform strategy, to measure strategy implementation. It's always good to think about high-fly strategies, but in the end, implementation is what makes the true difference, to really quantify these effects very quickly and see where you need to possibly course correct because something is not turning out as you hoped it would be, being able to quickly respond and, like a startup, to pivot that's a great value and a great way to repurpose, make the best use of ecosystem development budgets. So again, 360 and the KPIs and metrics provided should do that much quicker than any other tracking instrument we've had in the past. Currently, about 20 cities are working with Ecosystem 360. The number is growing very quickly, and we invite you all to evaluate what we have here and see how it can fit and be of use to your own development. Join our mission. Last words, please be part of the network. We would love to have all of you on board as we grow this incredible network of startup clusters. And I mentioned it before, let's learn as a community. Let's build a tight community all across the world. Let's peer benchmark so we learn from each other, but also let's have beyond the data, these qualitative discussions where we can share not only our successes, but as I mentioned, the failures, because the failures are ultimately the ones where we learn most, and do that in the confidence of the family of a network where we really can open up behind closed doors and really have these discussions. So we would love to see you all as members of the global startup ecosystem network that we are building since many years. Thanks so much for joining us today, and stay tuned here on our webpage for the next webinar that's coming. Let us know what's working well for you. Let us know where we can course correct what you didn't like today. We are particularly interested in any topics that you may wish to see on the agenda as a webinar, as a training webinar or learning experience. The next one I'm happy to announce is looking at ecosystem branding, where we try to dissect the factors that put you on the map as an ecosystem. What is attractive to investors? What is attractive to global talent? How do you attract this talent? How do you put yourself most effectively on the map of the global ecosystem community in the world? Thank you very much for joining us today, and back to the studio for now.